The Importance of Designing for Neurodiversity. Part 2. How Design's Influence Can Be Amplified for Individuals on the Spectrum. Hi there. In Part 1 of this two-part video series exploring the importance of designing for neurodiversity, we establish how influential the built environment is for so-called neurotypicals. In Part 2, let's see how this influence can be amplified for individuals on the spectrum whose brains may process sensory input differently. Welcome to Embrace by Design, the channel where we explore the intersection of design and neurodiversity. For those of you unfamiliar with the term neurodiversity, Dr. Nicole Baumer and Dr. Julia Freud do a great job in explaining its meaning in an article for Harvard Health Publishing. Neurodiversity, they write, describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. There's no one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving, and differences are not viewed as deficits. They go on to write that the word neurodiversity refers to the diversity of all people, but it is often used in the context of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, as well as other neurological and developmental conditions such as ADHD and learning disabilities. The word is also synonymous with a self advocacy movement that emerged in the 1990s and aims to increase the acceptance and inclusion of all people while embracing neurological differences. We use the term neurodiversity because it captures our core beliefs in the matter so well, and because it offers the perfect vantage point from which to explore the topic of design and autism. You see, neurodiversity implies a broad spectrum of how humans experience the world, and it infers that no one experience is more valid than another. Or, to put it another way, think of our experiences as being nothing more than input from our sensory systems coming together in the mind's eye. No two sensory systems are exactly the same, and thus, we all experience the world a little bit differently. This spectrum of experience follows along a bell curve in which the more typical sensory systems are in the middle, and the more atypical systems fall along the tails. When designers considered only the typical sensory system, the design will exclude whole swaths of the population, whereas if the scope of the design consideration is widened to be more inclusive, the utility of the design is enhanced for everyone, typical and atypical alike. This idea underpins the inclusive or universal design movements, and some good examples of how it plays out can be found in this vegetable peeler by OXO, which was originally designed for people with arthritis, but ended up transforming the product category. And cutaway curbs, which were originally designed for people in wheelchairs, but also benefit people pushing strollers and hand carts. Let's take a closer look at what we mean by atypical sensory systems and how they impact experience. Joseph Goldstein, a writer and meditation leader, once likened the whole of our experience to a six-piece orchestra comprising of our five senses and mind. Each sense is a different instrument, adding another unique layer in harmony with the others to produce an overall experience of the world. What if, however, one of the sensory instruments played louder than the others? What if they all played simultaneously at equal intensity? What would our experience be like then? Probably less like the music of life and more like an agitating cacophony. For people who have sensory processing disorder, which is closely associated with autism spectrum disorder, their senses don't always operate harmoniously or at equal intensity. With some individuals, known as sensory seekers, it takes a lot of sensory input even to register a sensation, while with other sensory avoiding individuals, the opposite is true, and seemingly innocuous inputs are quite harmful. Oftentimes, an individual has a sensory system that presents as both seeking and avoiding. A comprehensive review of neurophysiologic research in sensory processing found that more than 96% of children with autism report hyper and hyposensitivities, and the authors go on to suggest that the differences in sensory processing may actually cause core features of autism, such as language delays and difficulty reading emotions from faces. Beyond merely providing experience, our sensory system is massively influential in driving our behavior, which we can define in part as the way in which a person acts in response to a situation or stimulus. Breaking it down to its simplest form, there are only three basic responses we have to sensory stimuli. We either find it pleasant, which encourages us to seek out more of the input, or we find it unpleasant, which triggers avoidance, or we're neutral about it, finding the stimulus neither pleasant nor unpleasant. With such a simple vantage point, it's not hard to follow how even a short lived yet intense sensation can trigger big behavior. Take, for example, a scenario that happened to me the other day. I was walking barefoot across the room in my house when suddenly I stepped on a toy. My sensory system signaled a shock of pain, which I didn't like at all, and that initial sensation quickly turned to the feeling of anger. That feeling prompted me to quickly pick up the offending action figure and aggressively throw it into the toy bin. To my wife, who witnessed my pain induced mini tantrum, my behavioral response was comically overreactive. By the expression on her face, I could tell that she was thinking to herself, "Come on, man, get a grip." And you know what? She was right. In that moment, my reaction was so automatic and quick that I didn't have a conscious grip on it. In a nutshell, this is how environmental stimulus registered by our sensory system can trigger automatic emotional responses that in turn drive behavior. For some individuals in the neurodiverse community who have sensory processing disorder, the built environment itself can agitate the senses to the same degree as stepping on an action figure agitated mind. And like me, that agitation can trigger automatic avoidance behavior. These agitating environmental elements can be anything. They can be certain types of lighting, such as fluorescent, or certain types of sound frequencies, such as those produced by tires traveling at high speeds on grooved pavements. They can be certain textures in clothing or the smell of certain foods. They can come in the form of certain visual patterns or when the temperature rises above a certain comfortable degree. Don't get me wrong, so called neurotypicals experience agitating environmental elements too, but they tend to be mild enough to be ignored and they're merely thought of as sensory preferences. For people whose sensory system mutes or amplifies sensations, however, elements of the built environment can be under or overstimulating and consequently are more influential in driving automatic behavior. A relatively recent theory in neuroscience sheds light on how this might work. In 1994, Dr. Stephen Porges, an American behavioral neuroscientist, proposed a new theory that described the role of the vagus nerve in emotional regulation, social connection, and fear responses. While his polyvagal theory is super complex, and most of it lies well beyond the scope of what we've been talking about, is one aspect of Dr. Porges' research that is pertinent and will help give us a deeper understanding of why environmental factors can be so influential for individuals on the spectrum. In 2004, Dr. Porges coined the term neuroception and used it to describe the process of neurocircuits distinguishing between stimuli in order to identify whether a situation, person, or place is safe, dangerous, or life threatening. Basically, neuroception can be thought of as a subconscious safety alarm that precedes conscious perception. If our neuroception deems something, someone, or some place to be safe, we remain in a calm, receptive mood. And the more rational part of our brain, the neocortex, is influencing our behavior. If, however, our neuroception detects a threat to our safety, the neocortex loses influence, and our less rational baser brain takes over until the feeling of safety is restored. When we're in this heightened state of distress, emotions like fear, anger, and anxiety take hold, and focusing on anything other than trying to regain that sense of safety is super challenging, if not impossible. Scientists call this mode of action amygdala hijack, a term coined by psychologist Daniel Goleman, which conjures up imagery of our irrational brain holding our rational brain hostage, leaving us temporarily incapable of behaving in a rational, socially acceptable manner. It is important to note that amygdala hijack affects us all and is often used to describe behavior that's emotionally driven and seemingly overreactive, such as my reaction to stepping on that toy. Dr. Porges, along with many other researchers, attribute certain characteristics of autism and other neurological differences to what's been called faulty neuroception, which describes a nervous system that tends to detect threats when objectively none exist. Understanding how faulty neuroception might work, let's again look at what happened when I stepped on the toy. Clearly, the small action figure posed no real threat to me, but when stepping on it caused a sharp pain, my neurophysiology reacted as if I was under attack, which triggered the survival behavior of dispensing with a perceived threat as quickly as possible, literally picking it up and throwing it away from me. The threat wasn't real, but my mind, body, and behavior treated it as if it was, and it did so all well before I was even consciously aware or in control. Rather than being a rare, short-lived, or mild event, the experience of faulty neuroception happens much more often, lasts significantly longer, and is more intense for people on the spectrum. This intense dysregulation of the nervous system can result in a number of observable adaptive behaviors, both big and small. Small involuntary responses might include averting eye contact, stimming, fidgeting, or changing speech pattern and modulation, while big automatic responses might include physical aggression, running away, or becoming motionless, aka fight, flight, freeze. Beyond triggering involuntary avoidance behavior, which is unfortunately often taken as voluntary oppositional behavior, faulty neuroception negatively impacts health for the neurodiverse community. You see, when our survival instincts kick in, glucocorticoids, or stress hormones, flood our systems to prepare our bodies to fight, flight, or freeze. While glucocorticoids are great at helping us get out of life-threatening situations, our evolution only meant them to be active at higher levels in our systems for relatively short periods of time. Prolonged or chronic exposure to these stress hormones can lead to numerous psychological and physical issues. Neuroendocrinologist and author Robert Sapolsky devoted a whole book to the stress mechanism titled Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and he argued that the typical modern human is particularly susceptible to this type of chronic psychophysiological strain, which leads to depression, hypertension, anxiety, heart disease, and, as the title implies, ulcers. If modern neurotypicals are at an increased risk to the stress-related diseases brought about by prolonged and frequent activation of our automatic survival system, neurologically divergent individuals with faulty neuroception and atypical sensory systems are doubly so. All considered, it's not at all surprising that people on the spectrum are 3 times more likely to battle depression, nearly 5 times more likely to have anxiety disorders, and nearly 8 times more likely to have gastrointestinal issues than so-called neurotypicals. In part 1 of this 2-part video series, I argued that although we rarely notice or acknowledge it, design and architecture are powerful, ever-present, and active agents in the lives of us all. We saw just a few of the many ways in which the built environment interacts with the biology and psychology of so-called neurotypicals to influence their minds, bodies, and behaviors. In part 2, we explored how this influence can be amplified for the neurodiverse community through sensory processing disorder and faulty neuroception, and how this outsized influence can feasibly lead to bigger behaviors and more severe health consequences when compared to neurotypicals. To echo Don Norman, the reason the built environment so often goes unnoticed by neurotypicals is that the design and architecture fits their needs so well that it becomes invisible. This, unfortunately, is not the case for the neurodiverse community. Because the needs of autistic people are so rarely considered by designers and architects, the built environment itself can pose significant hurdles that hinder life rather than enhance it, an outcome that surely runs antithetical to the designer's intention. All is not lost, however. Designers and architects can expand the scope of their consideration to be more inclusive of the unique needs of neurologically divergent people. In so doing, the built environment can, as it does for neurotypicals, be enabling rather than disabling. Thankfully, creative professionals have, in fact, been moving towards inclusivity in recent decades. App developers have increasingly leveraged the power of personal devices, such as iPads, to facilitate communication and enhance the lives of people with ASD, especially nonverbal individuals. These days, buildings that cater to children on the spectrum almost always include a sensory room, which is used to satiate the unique sensory needs of the users. Even organizations such as the TSA the Transportation Security Authority, have designed autism-friendly processes to support people as they go through airport security. As we've seen, design is a powerful, ever-present, and active agent in life, and it can have an outsized influence on the lives of millions of people on the spectrum. Designers, architects, and other creative professionals are thus uniquely positioned to literally create a better world simply by expanding their knowledge and widening the scope of their design consideration. Such is the importance of designing for neurodiversity.